Welcome to Journalism History, a podcast that rips out the pages of your history books to re-examine the stories you thought you knew and the ones you were never told. I'm your host, Nick Hirshon, guiding you through your own drafts of history. This episode is sponsored by the Society of Professional Journalists chapter at William Paterson University in New Jersey. Oral history allows scholars to walk away from the microfilm reader, depart the dusty archives, and discover new perspectives on history through interviews with the people who lived it. In this episode, we will listen in on a panel discussion among 5 oral historians that took place at the recent conference of the American Journalism Historians Association in Salt Lake City, Utah. You'll hear from David Caruso, the editor of the Oral History Review, followed by Maggie Riveras Rodriguez of the University of Texas, then from myself, Nick Hirshon of William Paterson University, and finally from Ford Risley of Penn State University, the editor of American Journalism.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today. So I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about the journal, what we tend to publish, what we don't publish, and also provide an example of something that we would probably be interested in using some of the material that I research on. Clearly, I can't submit to the journal at this point in time, but I think it can give you a general sense of some of the things that we'd be interested in seeing in our journal. So the Oral History Review is the journal of record for the Oral History Association. It's been published since the mid-1970s. Currently, we have 2 volumes coming out per year, 2 issues coming out per year, roughly 200, 250 pages per issue. Each issue has roughly 3 or 4 articles, a number of book reviews, and media reviews as well. The individuals that send us articles do give us a wide variety of material to look at. One of the things that I would say immediately is that while we are the Oral History Review, we are not a journal that just publishes oral history interviews. So if you've gone out and you've interviewed someone, even if it's a very interesting and dynamic interview, we're not just going to publish that in its entirety. That's not what we're really interested in. What we look at for the Oral History Review are individuals who are using oral history as a methodology and engaging a bit with that methodology in the papers that they wind up submitting to the journal. So it's not just, I interviewed someone, I learned something interesting, let me tell you what I learned. It's thinking a little more deeply about the process itself and talking about that process while also recounting some of the stories that you learned or trying to tell the narrative that you're interested in conveying. We do have 2 to 3 types of articles that we wind up accepting in the journal on a regular basis. A traditional length piece you'd find in any other type of journal. We also accept short form pieces. These are much more theoretical, much more interesting idea kind of pieces. They don't necessarily have to be fully fleshed out. They don't need necessarily to be grounded in oral history methodology and other theories, but just about exploring a new idea, which you may not have answers to yet, but could be of interest to the oral history community itself. One that comes to mind almost immediately is a piece that someone submitted recently that gets into the idea of, when we talk to individuals who are victims of some sort of trauma, there are times where, while we're speaking with that individual, we may hear about a trauma we hadn't been expected, or maybe interviewing someone generally because of the nature of oral history, someone feels very open and actually tells us about a trauma experience that we weren't expecting as interviewers. And this author explored the idea of what to do in situations when you are exposed to a trauma that you didn't expect to hear, and how do you handle that with the interviewee. And that was a relatively short form piece that we will be publishing in the journal. But to give you a sense of generally what it is that we wind up publishing, I thought I would talk a little bit about one of the projects that I'm currently working on that focuses on science and disability. It really is a project that focuses on individuals in science, engineering, technology, and medicine who've had to adapt the way that they work to fit within quote-unquote able research structures. They've adapted research structures to fit their quote-unquote disabilities, or have decided to pursue different careers or career objectives because of current research structures. You can think of this in terms of the physicality of it. Think about I'm sure everyone here has done or participated in some sort of scientific lab, even in high school, middle school, college. Think about the layout of that lab and the benches that you tend to work at. They're set at a very specific height. If you cannot stand up, how do you work at that lab bench? If the aisleways are narrow and you're in, let's say, a wheelchair, how do you navigate down those aisles to get to the lab space? If you need to reach something that's stored high up, how do you do so? So those physical structures are sort of preventing people in certain ways from participation in science and technology. But again, it's not just the physical aspects. If you suffer from autism spectrum disorder or some other social anxiety, a lot of science is about interacting with other individuals, developing collaborations. How do you negotiate those spaces with those types of disabilities? So that's really what the project is focusing on. And just to provide one specific example of something that I encountered that was new to me during the course of the project, I had never interviewed someone who was deaf before. And during the course of interviewing a scientist who was deaf, we were using interpreters, sign language interpreters, to convey information back and forth. And what I began to realize during the course of that interview is I relied very much on facial expressions, the tone of my voice, to convey a certain amount of information to my interviewees. Sometimes I don't actually ask full questions. I trail off at the end because what I'm getting at tends to be implied. But when I have an interpreter in the room and that's being translated in a certain way, what I'm doing with my voice really has no meaning. So if I were interested in writing a piece for the Oral History Review, I would talk about what I'm learning from interviewing scientists with disabilities, but I would also talk about some of the complexities of doing the project from an oral history methodology or practice perspective. What does it mean to be using interpreters, or how those interpreters conveying information for me? One of the things that we've also come to realize in the project is that when we have transcripts of those interviews, the transcripts are based on what I said and what the interpreters responded, not what the individual signed. And there have been instances where the interviewee has told me what the interpreter said is not what I signed. And so my responses to what the interviewee said or my follow-up questions don't always make sense because there was something lost in translation. So if someone submitted an article to me talking about the project itself, some of the results of the project, but also engaging with the difficulties surrounding conducting that project, that's certainly something that I'd be very interested in publishing in the journal. There are also times where we have individuals talking about pedagogy, ways to teach oral history or how to engage students about oral history. So we do accept a broader list of topics for the journal. But again, I just wanted to stress that we're not publishing oral history interviews that you've conducted. You have to be engaging with the material in order for us to consider it. We are a traditional journal in the sense that we do peer review for all of our pieces. Once they come in, we do a preliminary assessment to make sure it meets with our guidelines, and we'll contact other oral historians to give their perspectives on the piece. Very often, I was looking at the statistics today, we have a roughly 30 to 40% acceptance rate. Part of that is we do regularly get people submitting just oral history interviews to us, and those are rejected immediately. But there are a fair number of pieces that we receive that even if they're not engaging with the methodology in the way that we would like them to from the outset, we're more than happy to work with authors to get them to explore that issue a bit more. And we go through the peer review process. We determine that it does have relevant material for the journal. And once it's been accepted for publication, then I start working with the authors directly to develop the pieces in ways that I think are most appropriate. Overall, from time of submission to time of publication, I'd say we're on average about maybe 9 months to a year at most. A lot of that is dependent on the author's time frame. We find that it takes 3 or 4 months sometimes for an author to get to revisions. But that's generally the process that we have for the journal and the types of articles that we've been interested in publishing in most recent years.
Thank you very much. Maggie, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right.
So I will see David, I'm sure, in Montreal next week at the Oral History Association conference. So I've been doing oral history since 1999, and our project, it's called the Voces Oral History Project, began as the U.S. Latino and Latina World War II Oral History Project. So we were really devoted to the Latino and Latina World War II experience. We produced 5 books from this. And the books how we've done it is, because I teach journalism and I come from a journalism background, my students would write journalistic treatments of their interviews or interviews somebody else did, and then we would do side-by-side edits from the interviews, and then it would go through a couple more revisions and fact-checking and copy editing. So our one of our books is exactly that. There's summaries of those longer stories. You can find the longer versions of stories on our website, vocesoralhistoryproject.org. So that's one thing that we've been doing kind of as a matter of course. But then we also wanted to incorporate not just oral history, but also some other work that other mostly historians have been doing on the Latina World War II experience. So the other 4 books are combinations of people that have used oral history and people who have just come from the history background and have really relied more heavily on archival and other secondary materials to fill out their chapters. The thing that we have found helpful is the material that we're developing and the research that we're developing is, for the most part, really not been done before. So the hard thing for us has been to tease out some of those themes and help scholars find ways of developing that research. So we've had a number of conferences and workshops. We've had workshops that were a week long. We've had other ones that were weekend long to show them how they can incorporate oral history into some publishable, peer-reviewed research. So we've spent some time on that. We launched our own journal, the U.S. Latina and Latino Oral History Journal, a year ago. Our next issue will be coming out this fall, I think sometime later this month. And that really does come out of wanting to promote the use of oral history in the study of research on Latinos and Latinas. We think that there's people that are not from oral history backgrounds, but they're really history backgrounds, and we want them to incorporate oral history because we know that that's one of the few ways that you can get at research on the Latino experience. Our population oftentimes doesn't have a lot of primary source materials other than oral histories, and a really scant amount of secondary materials. So the way that we can get to this is really from conducting oral histories ourselves. So our journal is really a way to promote the oral history in the study and research of Latinos and Latinas. So one thing we did find as we were putting our journal together is that there was a real need to do some additional training. A lot of people that were doing oral history, and I'm sure that David has had this experience as well, really have not been trained as oral historians. And so what they were submitting to us, or what they were submitting just as ideas before we even launched, were ideas that really showed that they didn't have that necessary training. So what we require, and I know this is true for David too, we require that whatever interviews are being incorporated into your research is actually recorded. We had instances of people who'd say, I did an interview, but what they had notes from an interview, which does not, in my book, classify that as an oral history interview. They didn't have consent forms. Even interviews that had been recorded and had been deposited at libraries and other archival repositories, they never got consent forms, and that's required whenever you're going to get published. And some of them would have interviews that they had recorded and had been sitting in their closets for a number of years. And so we started an Oral History Institute. We did it the first time in 2017, and then again in 2018. We try to keep it really limited. It's taught by me and Todd Moy, who's the president of the Oral History Association. We've been the two lead instructors of that. And people come from around the country and they learn the basics of oral history, but also a big thing that we spend a lot of time on is using this for research, using it so that you can publish oral histories. So everybody has a different take on it, and it's really a vibrant community of scholars that gets together. So that's one thing that I work on. The other thing that I work on is also through the AEJMC, we have a Trailblazers of Diversity in Trailblazers of Diversity in Journalism and Mass Communication, and that's a much smaller project that we do. We do the interviews mostly at the AEJMC convention. We did, I think, 5 in Washington, D.C. These are videotaped interviews, and they're housed, the original interviews are housed here at the Frisco Center for American History. And we've done a few panel discussions, and we've started putting together some treatments for research. But it really is, it's on the website. Unfortunately, we don't have a good URL to find it, so you have to do Trailblazers plus Frisco Oral History Center, AEJMC. But we do have those that are actually online, and they're synchronized. So they're synchronized, there's a transcript that's synchronized to the interview, which will make it much easier for interviewers, for researchers to go through and find that part of the interview that they want to focus on, and develop that into some research. I think the biggest challenge for most people that want to use oral history in their research is having it easily accessible. I know in our case, for the Latino de Voces Oral History Project, we haven't transcribed most of our interviews. So we're just doing a crowdsourcing project to be able to put synchronized transcripts and video up on our website. It's expensive and it's very time consuming, but for us to do that, we're able to share what we have with scholars around the world, and it'll make for easier methods of research. So I think that's about all I have.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, I'm here to talk about the Giving History a Voice, obviously the name of this panel, specifically how I used oral history interviews in my research on John Metz, meaning the New York Mets baseball team, Lindsay, and he was the mayor of New York in the 1960s, so I'll talk specifically how I did that for a upcoming journal article that will be in American Journalism. And I'm from William Patterson University, by the way, in New Jersey. So before I get into that, just to give you an idea of some other media history projects I've done that involved oral history, and I tend to research a lot of sports media topics, those of you who don't know about my research, and they're from like the latter half of the 20th century. So in most of the cases, the projects I've done involve people who are still alive, thankfully. And when I first started doing this research, when I was in my PhD program at Ohio University, a lot of people were talking about oral history maybe not being accepted as a serious research method, and that we focus mostly on archival research. But I thought if we're going to do something that's happening, for example, in the 1990s, there are plenty of people who have perspectives that have never been published before. So why don't we go get them? So just a few examples before I dive into the Lindsay stuff. I have an article coming out here. I'm sorry, this is the one that's coming out in 2019 in American Journalism about Phillies Jackpot Bowling. It's a sports television show, one of the first shows to put bowling on TV and popularized bowling in 1959 to 1960 on NBC. And even though I was doing this research around 2015, there were actually 4 bowlers who appeared on this show in 1959 who were still alive and still willing to be interviewed. So a lot of people in their mid to late 80s and early 90s who I was able to conduct phone interviews with for that piece. in addition to archival research and other sources. And then my doctoral dissertation, which is going to be published this fall, December 1st, by the University of Nebraska Press, is called We Want Fish Sticks, the infamous, bizarre and infamous rebranding of the New York Islanders hockey team. And for that project, I interviewed 52 people who were somehow involved in rebranding the team. Essentially, they changed their logo to this, which looks a lot like the Horton's Fisherman logo. And so I did interviews with designers, hockey players, executives who were involved in marketing this team, what went wrong. A lot of them had never done interviews before, so I couldn't just rely on the traditional archival interview, archival research. I did some microfilm research and all of that too, of course, but I thought it added a very valuable perspective, and I'll get into that when I look more specifically at Lindsay. So just again to update you on this, and I was getting confused about the dates before, but this article that I wrote in American Journalism that I believe came out last year was called One More Miracle, and it was about the groundbreaking media campaign of John Metz Lindsay, as I said. So he was the mayor of New York, elected in 1965, but when he's running for his second term in 1969, he had alienated the middle class, white people, and a lot of minorities. There were concerns because when he came into office, there were strikes by subway workers, firefighters, police, teachers, and then there was a big snowstorm that he bungled where the streets were not plowed for days, and that was the big thing that almost did him in. So he actually loses the primary. He was a Republican. He actually loses the Republican primary for his seat, so he decides he's going to run as a Liberal Party member, even though he is the incumbent. And one of the strategies he used was to find athletes who could be his surrogates. He came off as very elitist, patrician. He graduated from Yale. So one of the ways he figured he's going to reach out to minority voters and the white middle-class voters that he was losing is have athletes come to his aid and say, we can vouch for this guy, endorse him. And he was one of the first politicians to really do this so effectively. So he decides to do it with what was my favorite baseball team growing up, and to this day, sadly, the New York Mets. So in 1969, the Mets started the season 101 shots to win the pennant, and they had started out in 1962 as they had the worst record in Major League Baseball history. 40-120 is their record in their first season. But by 1969, they are starting to look up, and eventually, you don't need to get into all of this, but essentially they end up winning the World Series in very dramatic, spectacular fashion, and they call them the Miracle Mets because nobody expected them to win. This is all happening in October of 1969, right as we're having the lead up to the mayoral race. So Lindsay realizes that he's in New York, he can capitalize on this passion for the Mets by starting to associate himself with those players. And when they clinch the pennant, and then again when they win the World Series, he's in the clubhouse, and players actually douse him with champagne. And so you have this guy who has this image of being kind of stuffy and out of touch, but meanwhile all these athletes are just like spraying him with champagne. It makes him look more accessible, and it's kind of a refreshing image for a politician. So that's the research that I was doing. But then we get into the oral history aspect of it. So how would you do this? Well, for that article, I did look at, New York had 5 daily newspapers at that time, so I looked at all of them and their coverage of it, and there were a lot of photographs of Lindsay with the Mets. I did use traditional archives, like Lindsay went to Yale, so his archives are there, his papers, and New York mayor's papers always go to the New York City Municipal Archive, so I went there for some of that. But I also tried to do oral history because, again, 1969 was not that long ago when I was doing this research in 2015 about. So I went to Lindsay's aides, several of whom are still alive. Lindsay himself has passed away, but his aides are still alive. 2 of his children I interviewed, journalists who covered him, and a few Mets players like the folks that I have up there on the screen who were the guys in the photographs actually spraying champagne with him. And since I keep mentioning it, there you see one of these images. And so both of these guys, Ed Kranepool and Rod Gaspar, I did interviews with about that moment. They'd never really spoken much about it. It was something that I was just interested in because I had heard about it here and there growing up as a Mets fan. So the value of oral history to this project. And then here you just see some of the newspaper coverage. You get a sense of, it was on the front page of the New York Times. It went national. It was in newspapers across the country, and aired on TV too. So the value of oral history. So what can oral history add to our research that maybe you can't get from the newspaper article? A lot of color. And this came out certainly in my dissertation when I was interviewing those hockey players about what did you think of this Horton's Fisherman-like logo, and this crazy coach you had, and all these other issues that they had in that period. But just interviewing people like Rod Gaspar, who you saw there pouring the champagne on Lindsay, I asked him, why did you do it? Did you do it because there was some deeply held political feeling behind it? You wanted to help him win? And of course, as a historian, you're thinking, like, this could be all these different nuanced reasons. And he's like, no, he was fair game, so we nailed him. He was just in the clubhouse at the time, so we got that. And again, I think in bits and pieces, those sorts of things can add a lot to our research. Or some context. So Richard Aurelio, who is still alive, who was the campaign manager for Lindsay at that time, there was a lot of contention or a lot of discussion when those photographs were taken. Was it something that Lindsay had coordinated? Did he mean for it to occur? Or was it really just a spontaneous, he's the mayor of New York, so he ends up in the clubhouse and they're all celebrating and then he gets the champagne on him. But Aurelio made clear that this was actually something that they were trying to engineer. They knew that there was a lot of positive vibes in New York City surrounding the 1969 Mets. They knew Lindsay needed a boost in this re-election campaign, so they put him in the right place at the right time. Now, they didn't necessarily pay off the players to put the champagne on him, but you know that if you're putting him in that position, chances are something like that could occur. So getting that from the source, I think, really helped my argument that this was coordinated. This wasn't, as Lindsay wrote in a book, he called it a largely spontaneous event, and that it was unplanned and all of this. But not really, right? There were some people who were in his campaign who said the opposite. Now, there are also challenges to oral history research, and this came up, many different challenges, obviously, that we have with it. But I learned that memory is fallible, of course, and so when you're interviewing people in 2015 about something that happened back in 1969, especially when I was trying to get into specifics, there's a lot that people may not recall exactly right. So one of the people who I interviewed, I mentioned before, was Lindsay's children. So he had a daughter, Margaret. He also had a son, John Lindsay Jr., big shoes to fill. And when I first contacted him, I was a little bit wary. I had read a lot of news coverage of him, and over the years, he unfortunately had a drug addiction. He ended up in prison. There were news clips that were talking about John Lindsay, the mayor, going to his son's hearing and court hearing, so he had a trying life. But also, when I look back at the actual clippings from 1969, he accompanied his father at a lot of these games. And I think he was about 7 years old at the time. So I thought maybe he would have some memories. He was in the clubhouse and so forth. But when I interviewed him, and he kept telling me, I'm sorry, I don't remember a lot. And he was trying to help. And I think that's sometimes a challenge of oral history, is that they want to help us. And they know that we're looking for something and they want to give it to us. But we don't want them to say anything that isn't true. So then he told me at this point, they invited the Mets over to Gracie Mansion. Gracie Mansion is where the mayor of New York City lives, afterward for a celebratory cocktail party. And he said the only thing he really remembered well was that he got to meet Roger Clemens. Anyone a baseball fan who knows what would be the problem with that? Is that Roger Clemens in 1969 would have been 7 years old. So he said that, and I immediately, on the recording, you can hear me say oh. Because I just couldn't hide it, because I was thinking, I just got this guy, and now he's misremembering. Again, not his fault, it's just he's trying to help. And so I said, I think you're confusing it, because what he was thinking was Roger Clemens played against the Mets in the 1986 World Series. The Mets don't get to the World Series that often, so it's easy to conflate. And so I think that's how it came up. But that's just something we have to be aware, and I've told my students about this when I was doing my dissertation research. A lot of times when I was interviewing the hockey players from the Islanders about games, and they would all give different scores of games and things. So I tried to stop asking them about that, because I didn't care about that anyway. That I could find from some hockey reference website. You could find from a newspaper article. I tried to focus more on what were their emotions, or can they confirm something that is a thesis in my mind, or and you want to ask open-ended questions. It's difficult. You don't want them just to confirm what you have planted, but sometimes asking those sorts of things. And just quickly before I wrap up, I just want to make a quick pitch for using oral history in our classroom. So actually, this just happened to work out right before we have this panel on Thursday. On Tuesday night, I partnered at my university, William Paterson, New Jersey, with the Queens Memory Program. They're based in New York City, in the borough of Queens, where the Mets play. And they collect oral history interviews with just average anybody who has either lived, worked, or attended school in the borough of Queens. So the director of the program, Natalie Milbrook, came from New York to New Jersey to talk to my students about it, and all of my students are going to be doing oral history interviews with artists from Long Island City, which is a artist neighborhood known for that sort of stuff. We're going to work over the course of the semester to get them into the city, meeting these people. We've had them do a lot of readings by media history scholars who are here today. So I just say, again, remember we're doing this in our research, but sometimes it's fun to work it into what our students, the next generation of AJHA scholars will do. So there's that. So thank you very much for coming.
My comments are going to be fairly brief. I think my main role here can be to help answer questions that you all have, especially from the perspective of the journal. But I have an interest in oral history really in two ways. One, as editor of the journal, I love to see, frankly, articles like Nick's that use oral history and use them effectively. I also have them from personal because I direct a little oral history program that we have in our journalism department at Penn State, where we interview Pennsylvania journalists. It's something we've done. So anyway, I have an interest in oral history in that way, just from my own personal work. But as far as editing the journal goes, as I said, I love to see articles that are submitted that use oral history. Of course, I'm not the final judge. They go out for review, and it's the reviewers itself that decide, whether an article or a manuscript gets the thumbs up or thumbs down. Of course, and Nick pointed out several of these things. Interviews should be just one tool that scholars use, just one tool in your toolkit. You can't rely on them exclusively, but they, again, as Nick said, they provide that wonderful color, that context that can really just add a really nice feature to a lot of work. We trust that the interviews are done properly, that we have to, that the historian, whether using their own oral history interviews, as Nick has done, or using the interviews of other people, done by other people, are done right. The other thing that I think I would caution about is overusing interviews, relying on them exclusively in terms of not only the research but the writing. They provide, of course, a nice narrative element to any article, but they can't be used exclusively. One thing as editor that I've never been a big fan of, and we try not to do a lot of in the journal, are just block quotes. And of course, that's easy to do. I would say it's lazy writing in many ways, and authors generally hear from me if they have overused quotes in their work. So that's something that we always caution against. But I would really commend Nick's article on the Mets and Lindsay as a good example of how to use oral history and use it effectively as just one more tool in the historian's toolkit. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Round of applause for all.
Thanks for tuning in. An additional thanks to our sponsor, the Society Professional Journalists Chapter at William Patterson University. Until next time, I'm your host, Nick Hirshon, signing off with the words of Edward R. Murrow. Good night and good luck.